Hello, everyone, and welcome to Practicing Presence, Mindfulness in Psychotherapy with Adults. My name is Nicole, and I'm pleased to be joining you from the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. Today, we're joined by Dr. Anne-Marie Gockel, who is a psychologist and associate professor of social work at Smith College. Anne-Marie has researched mindfulness in clinical training and community-based interventions and has used mindfulness in training social work clinicians and in her practice of science-seeking counseling services. She received training in the mindfulness-based stress reduction program at the UMass Medical Center, and her own teachings are grounded in her ongoing mindfulness practice. For this webinar, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A, so please be sure to chat in your questions to the right of your screen as they come up, and we'll do our best to address those toward the end of the webinar, sorry. So, Dr. Gockel, we're honored to have you join us and present your work today. And let me go ahead and hand this off to you, and you can get us started.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Welcome, everyone. So we're not getting a chance to meet face-to-face today, so this is sort of a little substitute so you don't feel like you're talking simply to a disembodied voice or listening simply to a disembodied voice. This is me leading a practice where I work normally at Smith College, and so just wanting to welcome you to Practicing Presence, Integrating Mindfulness into Psychotherapy with Adults today. And because mindfulness is all about our contact with the present moment, and this is a moment of transition for all of us from whatever we were doing before, work or caregiving or some other daily activity, to this webinar, I'm going to invite us to actually begin with a brief mindfulness activity just to give us an opportunity to check in and orient to the present moment. So I'm going to invite you to remember that whatever guidance I offer throughout this webinar, you're in charge of where you place your attention. So if any particular instruction isn't appropriate for you in this moment, you can always choose to listen without actually engaging in the practice I'm leading. Or you can always choose to direct your attention to some more appropriate object of focus for you, such as sounds in the room, the breath, body sensations, or another object in the room. And so if you're willing, I'm going to invite you to just begin with a brief stretch. And if it's possible for you and you've been sitting all day, you might want to stand to do this, but you can also do this sitting. And so just inviting you to begin by, if you can, bringing your arms up from your sides to reach overhead, stretching towards the ceiling, and really feeling that extension of your arms. And maybe down through the arm and into the shoulder, and the mid-back and the lower back. Only holding this or any other position for as long as is right for you. And if you like, bending at the waist and bringing the arms over towards the right. So you're in a half moon kind of shape, and you're feeling this stretch on the left side of your body. So in the left torso, shoulders, and coming back to center, stretching over towards the left side of the body, and feeling that stretch in the right torso. And coming back to center and reaching up one more time. And then allowing the hands to come back down. Perhaps feeling the movement of the air as you bring them down slowly. And just taking a moment to feel the impact of just this subtle single stretch as you're standing or sitting. And then finding your way to a comfortable seat. And so I'm going to invite you to choose a seat where your posture can be somewhat erect and alert, but not rigid. So your body can be relatively comfortable. And maybe with your feet touching the floor if that's a possibility for you, and the hands resting in your lap. And you might at this point want to find a neutral spot on the floor to soften your gaze, or on the wall, or if you're comfortable closing your eyes. And just taking a moment to feel the support of the chair beneath you and the contact of the feet in the floor. Maybe the contact of your hands on your lap. And beginning to allow whatever came before to move into the background and feeling yourself arriving fully in this moment, in this seat, in this moment. And checking in just to get a sense of how you are in this moment. And then if you like, if your eyes are closed, opening them again, and taking a moment to look around the room that you're in. Just orient to the room again. And as you like, to orient back to the webinar screen. So this is a brief but simple practice that I often use to help both myself and my clients check in, reorient, and make contact with where they are and how they are in the present moment. The great thing about mindfulness is that it's always available. We can always pause and turn our attention to our experience as it's arising in this moment. Whatever we find, the very act of tending to our experience is clarifying. Clients often report that they feel fresher, more alert, and more aware of their own experience, even from this brief practice. The difference in the quality of both my own attention, if I engage in this with them, pause for a moment, and the difference in the client's availability in session can be quite profound. So over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to touch on some key practical ways that you can draw on mindfulness to facilitate the process of psychotherapy, regardless of your theoretical orientation. My objectives will be to give you some examples of simple but powerful ways to weave mindfulness into your work with clients presenting with a broad variety of common issues. So you're going to learn about 3 elements of mindfulness-based psychotherapy, using mindfulness with body sensations, states of mind and feelings, and practical tips on things to think about as you work with adapting mindfulness to the needs of particular clients. A few words about mindfulness itself as we begin. With the increasing popularity of mindfulness, the definitions of mindfulness abound, and each one emphasizes a slightly different aspect of mindfulness. This is a montage of common elements associated with mindfulness. Perhaps for our purposes here, I can suggest that we think about mindfulness as a quality of awareness that arises when we're able to attend to our present moment experience with interest and curiosity. Mindfulness is both a state that comes and goes. We can be relatively more or less mindful in each moment, and it's also a trait that can be developed through deliberate practice over time. The good news is that there's really no end to mindfulness. We can always continue to deepen our ability to see and relate to our experience with the clarity and resourcefulness that mindfulness provides. And so mindfulness is an innate capacity that we all have available, and it can and does occur spontaneously. Perhaps you've had those moments where you're watching something very beautiful, and suddenly everything else drops away and you're really keenly present, alive, and aware. But more often, in order to be sustained, mindfulness has to be deliberately cultivated by engaging in a range of formal meditative practices. The most common practices now considered under the rubric of mindfulness in a secular context in the West include concentration practices, where the practitioner learns to stabilize attention on a particular object of focus, often starting with the breath or body sensations, and gradually moves towards more open or choiceless awareness, where one attends to a shifting array of phenomenon as it arises in the field of consciousness, and usually one moves from one to the other as concentration strengthens over time. So in addition, most mindfulness training also includes an introduction to loving kindness practice or compassion practices where the focus is on extending kindness or compassion, and sometimes as well to other visualization-based practices like the mountain meditation, which help people develop particular resources. Formal meditation practice is often key to being able to gain enough separation from our ordinary habits of mind to see how the mind works and to begin to work with the mind and our experiences in a new way. Although formal practices are a great training ground, ultimately we want to be bringing mindfulness into our everyday life. And we can begin to weave mindfulness into our daily experience through informal practice, where we bring our full attention to a routine daily task or experience such as eating, taking a walk, or making a cup of tea. And that's often a really accessible and rich place to start with clients. The most helpful model for thinking about mindfulness in psychotherapy that I found was developed by Paul Fulton, and I've depicted it here. He suggests that there's a continuum of approaches to integrating mindfulness in psychotherapy that move from the implicit, what you do as a clinician for yourself in your own life, towards the increasingly explicit use of deliberate practices in session with clients. And so each aspect of the continuum, moving from left to right, builds on the one before it and has an effect on the psychotherapy process. The three major elements to mindfulness in psychotherapy that I'm going to highlight as you're reading on the continuum include clinician's own mindfulness practice at the most implicit end, and then the clinician's bringing of their awareness from their practice and the insights from their practice. This represents the next two nodes on the continuum into the process of psychotherapy. And finally, the last two buttons on the continuum at the most explicit end is actually directly using practices with clients in session, either briefly or eventually in a more extended way. We're going to be covering each aspect of the continuum with examples as we move through the webinar. So the first element is really about starting where we are with the clinician's own mindfulness practice. This is important because mindfulness isn't a technique you can learn and practice a little, sort of like you might use a CBT thought record where you learn about it, you do it with clients, and you sort of have it. You never really get to the point where it's sort of like, I'm done. I've got mindfulness. I can put that away. It's a tool in my kit. Rather, because mindfulness is an ongoing way of relating to one's experience, and it continues to deepen with practice, it's always changing, the introduction of mindfulness really needs to be rooted in the clinician's own ongoing formal and informal mindfulness practice. And starting with your own practice serves three really important goals. One is just supporting your own ability to manage stress and to increase your own health and well-being. Of course, the better resourced we are, the more we have to bring both to our clients and to our life outside of work. And we also know that even if you never talk to a client about mindfulness or introduce them to a practice explicitly in session, your own personal mindfulness practice can still benefit your clients. Research suggests that mindfulness can help you cultivate some key therapeutic qualities that might make you more effective as a clinician, and that mindfulness your mindfulness practice that is, may positively impact client outcomes. Mindfulness has been positively related to clinician attention and empathy, and at least one controlled trial found that the clients of trainees who attended a meditation course before seeing their clients each day had better outcomes, including greater symptom reduction, increases in their problem-solving ability, and that these clients reported making more progress in overcoming their difficulties than the clients of clinicians who didn't attend the meditation course. So this is a list of some of the psychological benefits that both we and our clients can gain from ongoing mindfulness practice. It's easy to see as you look at this list how many of the qualities listed not only benefit our own psychological health and well-being, but are also important for enhancing the therapy relationship. Things like attentiveness, self-awareness, affect tolerance, cognitive flexibility, all contribute to being more effective in the session room, as well as to our own well-being. And so I'm going to invite you to take another pause and engage in another practice. Remember again that you're in charge of where you direct your attention, and you can always choose to listen without engaging, or you can choose a different object of focus if what I'm leading doesn't work for you. So there are sounds in the room, you can look at a particular object, or you can focus on the breath or body sensations, whatever fits for you in the moment. And so if you're willing now, again, softening the gaze by finding a neutral spot to look at, or closing your eyes if you're comfortable. And just inviting you this time to turn towards the breath and just begin to notice the flow of the breath in the body where you feel it most prominently in this moment. So that might be at the tip of the nostrils, feeling the air come in and out, Might be with the rise and the fall of the chest. Or it might be with the expansion and contraction of the abdomen. So we're not just thinking about our breath, but actually bringing our attention to wherever we feel those physical sensations of the breath moving in and out most prominently in this moment. And perhaps noticing the flow of the breath, the quality of the breath. Is it moving slowly or quickly? It may be that the breath is flowing fully and freely, or there may be little places where the breath catches. Seeing if it's possible to simply attend to the breath exactly as it is. You may find that there's an impulse to change or fix the breath, control the breath in some way. And if that occurs, just noticing it and seeing if it's possible to rest with the breath exactly as it is. Something already going very well for you today. The breath moving through the body. And so knowing that it's possible to stay with or to return to the breath, using the breath kind of as a reliable resting place for the attention. Knowing that this is an option, you can choose this option, or if you're willing, I can invite you to expand the focus of your attention and let the breath move into the background and become aware of body sensations. Perhaps noticing first the contact of your feet in the floor, again the support of the chair. Perhaps the feeling of the air on exposed skin on the face or arms, and maybe even the feeling of the clothing on the skin. And becoming aware too of the sensations arising internally. And there may be areas where you're noticing some tension or soreness in the body. And maybe areas also of ease or spaciousness. Seeing if it's possible to welcome whatever is arising. And noticing too if there's any reaction or resistance, allowing and welcoming that. You may notice some tingling or another movement of energy through the body. And so again, it's possible to simply stay with being aware of body sensations as a whole. Or if you like, I'm going to invite you to begin to focus on any area of the body where there's a particularly pleasant sensation in this moment. Or if there are no pleasant sensations available to you, neutral sensations. So bringing the attention to the place in the body where there is most comfort in this moment. And just getting a sense of attending to those sensations. What do you notice? Do they grow larger or smaller? Maybe there's a particular reaction to attending to pleasant or neutral sensations. Allowing it all in. And just seeing what happens. And then with the next out breath, releasing the focus on pleasant or neutral sensations and just resting back on the breath for a moment. And then as you're ready, if you've closed your eyes, opening them, and gradually refocusing on the webinar screen. So another key element of mindfulness practice is that it's an embodied experience. The body and sense experiences are an excellent resource for bringing us out of our heads and into contact with the present moment. This is a very brief version of a practice I might use in psychotherapy to help people work with a wide variety of disorders involving physical sensations, such as pain disorders, eating disorders, or the urges accompanying addictive disorders. On this slide, you can see a list of some of the disorders that engage the body or have a physiological component where mindfulness has been found to be helpful. Certainly, we know that mindfulness has an effect on strengthening a variety of body systems, from the immune system to the brain structure and functioning, and that some of these effects are also noted on this slide. I often use a focus on pleasant or neutral sensations where they are accessible as a way to help trauma survivors begin to connect with the body, often a source of distress for many folks with trauma, this time as a potential resource. Most folks, even those with ongoing pain, pardon me, have an area of the body where they can access either pleasant or at least relatively neutral sensations. Once we can establish a relationship with pleasant or neutral sensations as an anchor for working with sensation, trauma survivors have a point from which they begin to explore areas of arousal or dysregulation in the body in a more measured and manageable way, so that they can begin to work with and integrate rather than being overwhelmed by their sensory experience. A second key element of mindfulness practice is bringing the insights of the practice into the session room. So even if you don't directly introduce a guided practice, the learning from your own practice can productively inform the process of therapy. There are many, many insights that we integrate from our own practice that richly contribute to therapy. So for example, noticing that everything continues to change, that we're all interconnected, that our power lies more in what we focus on or in the way that we choose to respond to events than in the events themselves. Part of the benefit of these insights is that they're not just concepts, they're not just something someone told us or part of a therapy model that we learned. They're actually lessons on the nature of the human journey that we've managed to internalize after having seen them and experienced them over and over again, both on and off the meditation cushion. In this way, they may likely fit with the key learnings from a variety of different therapy paradigms, while having a particular power of wisdom that we've gained from our own experience. These insights from practice can often be uniquely useful as a source of wisdom in the clinical relationship. So for example, one of the key insights that I often find myself circling around over and over again is that resistance to what is creates suffering, while acceptance facilitates change and ultimately empowers us and our clients to respond creatively to our experience. So I was recently working with a client who reminded me of this insight in a pretty powerful way. She was struggling with her anger over a relationship that ended abruptly. How could her ex have behaved like that? What had she done to deserve this? Why had this happened to her? She kept replaying what she could have said or done to have caused this breakup, and she kept imagining what she could do to make it different. She wasn't eating or sleeping regularly, and the rumination was all-consuming for her. So not surprisingly, she was quite depressed at the start of the therapy process, and she seemed like the picture of resistance to me. So I started to talk with her about whether she was aware of any resistance she might have to the relationship having ended. Although we could have explored this purely at a conceptual level initially, in this case she was open to exploring some of the physical sensations related to resistance, which she initially experienced as being like an immovable weight in her chest. She was able to first imagine and then with some support to start to act out a physical movement of pushing away and holding off, which for her represented her body and her mind's resistance to the event. And as she enacted this movement, she began to get in touch with the physical tension and the energy involved in the act of resisting. She began to feel the physical toll it was taking, and as she engaged with the sensations of resisting, she suddenly had the insight that the resistance was futile. Her ex was as she was, and she wasn't going to change. and the resistance gave way to tears. Although the grief she was experiencing was deeply painful, she discovered that it was also a little bit of a relief. She felt less trapped in her ruminations, and gradually she was able to begin eating and sleeping more normally again. In this circumstance, my interventions were guided, at least in part, by the repeated insight of having observed and experienced at an embodied level the nature of resistance and its contribution towards suffering. Although it's through our own practice of mindfulness that we have an opportunity to gain insight from our direct experience of life as it unfolds and to turn conceptual knowledge into functional wisdom. As we see for ourselves the common pitfalls of the mind over and over again, we're increasingly able to help our clients begin to mine this information available in their own direct experience of their lives to facilitate change. In this way, our insights become like a lighthouse on a stormy day, a beacon to help us and our clients move through the rocks in our path. This diagram shows the process that happened for this client, and which I've seen happen for many, where mindfulness helped the client identify and begin to explore the actual experience of resistance, which then gave way to the insight on the futility of resistance and allowed for a reorganization into, in this case, further acceptance of the situation and an approach to the underlying grief she was experiencing. As clients begin to be able to truly observe and inquire into their own experience as it unfolds, their insights grow and they get excited and engaged. Clients also start to feel uniquely empowered when they begin to realize that they have an inexhaustible source of wisdom just by attending with interest and curiosity to their own moment-to-moment experience. The third aspect of integrating mindfulness into psychotherapy is introducing mindfulness practice into your session work with clients directly. So how do you choose the right activity at the right time for the right person? Informed consent, of course, is a primary focus, as it would be with any psychotherapy. Is the client interested and receptive when you explain how mindfulness might be beneficial? It isn't of interest to every client, and of course, it's ultimately the client's choice. Another important part of informed consent is exploring the risks and the benefits, and many of the risks and the benefits are similar to the risks and the benefits of other kinds of psychotherapy. At the start, as the client begins to attend to their experience in detail, the chances, at least initially, and this might differ from other kinds of psychotherapy, is that as they experience their thoughts, feelings, and sensations more directly, they become heightened. And that includes sensations of pain or anxiety. Clients will also become more aware of their issues, concerns, and patterns, and that's, of course, a double-edged sword. So self-awareness helps us better understand and work more effectively with our experiences, but it also comes at the cost of seeing things we don't necessarily like or seeing ourselves repeat painful patterns in our lives. Although the research tells us that mindfulness fosters self-regulation on average among groups of people represented in research studies, there are no guarantees for any one client. So there's no guarantee that anyone's going to achieve a particular goal, such as anxiety reduction. And when clients do start to experience positive changes, they don't always come exactly as expected. So for example, I'm recalling an executive I worked with who wanted to work on handling stress better so that he could be more productive. And he realized kind of about halfway through our working together that actually what he really wanted to do was shift the nature of his work so he wasn't having to work all the time and produce at the level that he was expecting himself to produce at that moment. And so he ended up being more efficient in his work, but also taking more time outside of work to enjoy a more balanced life. Although this was ultimately a positive change for him, it wasn't initially what he expected, and it wasn't initially what his family was prepared for either. So we also want to ensure that we have a solid footing in the practices that we use with our clients. We want to have a familiarity with the experience and to understand what some of its pitfalls can be so that we can adjust the practice to meet the needs of each particular client. It's very difficult to make these adjustments if we don't have a solid foundation in the practices for ourselves. We also want to match the practices we choose to the client's level of readiness. So we want to start with more concrete objects of focus like the breath and body sensations, which are easier to focus on initially, and move towards more abstract objects of focus like thoughts and feelings that are more challenging to observe, only when concentration strengthens. Similarly, we want to begin with shorter periods of practice and work towards more extended periods of practice, provide more guidance and support, and work towards less guidance and support. And of course, we want to be checking in along the way to see how the client's receiving the practice so that we can help them adjust accordingly. We also want to know our clients and select the practices we choose to meet their specific needs. So for example, clients with disorders related to breathing may initially become more activated or even panic if by focus on the breath, which is the common initial anchor point that I've just used here as well. That's why it's important to encourage folks to follow their own guidance first and to offer them choices and to carefully debrief the practices that you do in sessions so that you can adjust them as needed. For clients who have difficulty with breathing, it can be helpful to use sounds in the room or other sense experiences as an anchor initially. And there's no one-size-fits-all. We also want to think about how much interoception the client can tolerate. So if every time they focus internally, they're plunged into negative rumination and they have little ability to disengage, well, that's not really so helpful. This exercise might be outside of their zone of tolerance at the moment. So with a client who's easily lost in negative rumination, I might start by getting them out of their head and into their sense experiences, tasting, touching, hearing, inviting them to notice the impact of routine activities in these sensory realms on their state of being. It's not that we abandon more challenging practices, rather we can work towards them step by step in a titrated fashion. So we're going to pause again and take another moment, building on the practice that we just did, and turning the attention inward once again. And picking up on the breath for a moment. And becoming aware, again, of the sensations of the breath, almost as though this were the first time, even though it's not. Pace of the breath at this moment. Again, not needing to fix or change, just simply allowing. And knowing that it's always possible to simply rest here with the breath. Or if you like, beginning to allow the breath to move into the background, knowing that you can always return to it. And opening instead to getting an awareness, sense of the mood and the feelings that are present in this moment. It may just be a general mood, like the weather of the mind. Or you may begin to be able to discern specific feelings. And the feelings might be clear and strong, or they might be more subtle. Seeing if it's possible to simply welcome the feelings that are present. And so you might notice that there are some pleasant feelings. There might be feelings that are a little bit more unpleasant or uncomfortable. There may be an overall sense of calm where there's not many particular feelings, or a sense of numbness. There's no right or wrong. Simply welcoming what's here. And so knowing that it's also possible to rest the attention on welcoming feelings as a whole, if you're willing, beginning to actually focus in on any particular feeling that's showing up where you find yourself having some interest and curiosity. And allowing yourself to begin to approach wherever you feel this feeling most prominently in the body now. So it may feel diffuse throughout the body, or there may be a particular place where you sense it most strongly. So imagining as if in your mind's eye you could walk up to the feeling and get close enough to make contact, but stay far enough to not become overwhelmed. And just taking a moment to hang out with the feeling here. Again, knowing that you always have the choice to come back to the breath if that's what's indicated for you. And so perhaps noticing any reactions or responses to simply being with this feeling. Noticing if it shifts or changes, or it may remain exactly the same. And imagining in your mind's eye that this feeling has some wisdom to share with you. And if you're willing, inviting, receiving whatever that wisdom is in this moment. And that might show up as images or thoughts or other feelings, or nothing in particular may occur. Just hanging out with it as it is. And with your next out breath, letting go of that particular feeling, moving back to the breath as a whole. Maybe noticing any subtle shifts and changes in the breath. And if you've closed your eyes, opening them, and gradually refocusing on the webinar. So this is a brief version of an exercise I use with clients to help them begin to experience a more direct relationship with both pleasant and unpleasant emotions in a supported context. So I'm always offering choices to allow the client to do what's appropriate for titrating and managing the experience. And the choices can be part of the discussion afterwards. So if a client plunges directly into the most difficult possible feeling and gets caught up in this difficulty, this becomes a topic of exploration. If the client never approaches a challenging feeling, that's another place for exploration. I want to try to stay connected to the client and to understand what's happening at every stage of the process. So taking into account what I notice about changes in their breath and body posture, their coloring and muscle tone, as well as the verbal report of their experience, and my own internal sense of the process, including what I might be picking up countertransferentially. At any particular point, if an experience is too intense, we can always make a choice to take a step back, slow down, or refocus the attention. Or if it's manageable, we can always spend a little longer exploring any particular experience and building the capacity to tolerate it in the moment. For example, I recall a client where I used this exercise to help her approach feelings of anxiety. This was a client that was so routinely hyper-aroused that she often seemed to be in a state of perpetual motion. We've all had clients like this. She had a history of previous assault and some residual trauma symptoms and ongoing generalized anxiety that she tried to avoid at all costs. It was critical for her to start to approach feelings of anxiety first from a distance, getting a sense of the edges of her experience, and discovering that she could approach and then withdraw from the experience. As she gained more of a sense of her own agency in directing her attention, she was increasingly able to approach and to explore more of her anxiety. eventually discovering that she could survive it, she could tolerate it, she could even sometimes take action while she was feeling anxious. She also gradually came to see that anxiety didn't always remain the same. Often when she started to pay attention to it, it would be greater in intensity, and gradually over time it started to decrease in intensity. She also started to see more and more of the feelings underlying or relating to some of her anxiety, the particular fears and beliefs that fed into it. And she could start to understand and try to work with some of these feelings and beliefs. So of course, as we know, the more she welcomed her anxiety, the less it stopped her and the more it actually diminished over time. I illustrated her process and her progress through anxiety with mindfulness with the half figure made of partial circles. So although the stages are more messy and interwoven than the diagram suggests, she generally moves from approaching to exploring to tolerating to acting in spite of to learning from and about the anxiety. I chose this picture for her story because one of the biggest realizations she had in the process was although she thought the anxiety would blow her apart when she went into it, she came to know that the storm would always eventually pass and she'd still be standing. She didn't need to let anxiety stop her from doing many, many things that she wanted to do. So that brings us to the end of the formal part of this presentation. And so to summarize, we examined 3 key elements of mindfulness and psychotherapy, establishing a foundation of mindfulness practice for ourselves, bringing the insights and benefits of our practice into session, and then directly integrating mindfulness exercises into our work where clients are interested and receptive. We talked about and you experienced some examples of mindfulness practices that you can use to help clients work with body sensations, states of mind and feelings. And we also identified strategies for selecting and adapting different forms of practice to the specific needs of each client, with a focus on how to introduce the practices in a titrated way that responds to the client's unique needs. I also talked about some examples of using mindfulness practices with clients with anxiety, depression, trauma, and relationship issues. And so I've included a final page of resources that you can look at your leisure, really about extra readings and websites that can be helpful in terms of psychotherapy practice with mindfulness. So thank you for spending this time with me, and I look forward to your questions. I'm going to hand the presentation back to Nicole then.
All right, and moving into our question and answer session. The first question we have for you is, can you point to any specific research linking mindfulness to clinical outcomes?
Yeah, there's a study by Gretmer and colleagues. It's out of Germany, and that's the one that I was citing. And they're actually, so that's the clearest study in that that was a study, as I described, on trainees who, it compared trainees who were attending a meditation course. It was a double-blind controlled trial. Trainees who were attending a meditation course, their outcomes, their client outcomes, with the client outcomes of trainees who were not, didn't have that kind of training at the same time. And so, as I said, there was greater symptom reduction for the trainees, for the clients of the trainees attending the meditation course. They also found some skill changes, and their reports of their own progress were different. So I would say that's the most quality trial that's there so far. There's still a lot of research to come. There have been other studies that show relationships between clinician empathy and their level of mindfulness, clinician well-being and their level of mindfulness, clinician attention and their level of mindfulness. But the research is still at a fairly early stage.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, have you ever connected mindfulness to the practice of motivational interviewing?
Well, I can see a lot of the relationship, so I haven't done that specifically. I feel as though the process itself is mindfulness as a process. One of the things that it does is it plugs into the client's own interest and curiosity about their life. And so that's on the topic of motivation, but not directly connected to motivational interviewing. So I don't have a specific resource for that. But I think it's a common therapy problem to get folks interested and engaged in experiences that are unpleasant. And one of the things that I've really found in using mindfulness is that because people start to see their own experience as this incredible resource, it sometimes can get people really motivated about what the possibilities are. Something that they normally would move away from actually ends up being really positive, and they can see how that unfolds. They can see their own power in breaking their patterns.
Okay, great. And do you provide guided visualization in detail, or do you simply focus on breathing, feelings, and sensations in your practice?
So it really depends. Visualization gets used, so it can get a little confusing because there's so much out there now. Visualization has a long and well-respected history. And usually the way that it's used in mindfulness practices can be different than the way that it's used in other settings, in that in mindfulness practice it's all about connecting with something that's actually here in the present moment rather than going somewhere else. So if I do use visualization, I try to use it in that context, in the way that I just did in terms of working with feelings. It wasn't about doing something else with the feeling, it was about trying to actually connect with the feeling and be with the feeling. And visualizations also, in some ways, are more complicated than other kinds of practices. They have more layers to them, people have more associations with them, and more individual reactions to them. So, for example, I've had a lot more come up in leading loving kindness practice than I have in mindfulness of the breath. And so you really always have to take that into account, take into account who you're doing this with or for and what the context is. So I would say I use the full range of things, but I don't tend to go to practices that are more complex until I have tried some of the more basic practices, also because people also it helps people to get lost in their heads sometimes. But that said, there are exceptions. So for example, in terms of adapting the practice to the needs of an individual client, sometimes when I've had clients with really high levels of self-judgment, such self-judgment that it interferes so much with a basic practice, I might start them with loving kindness, a simple version of loving kindness, really to start to address an issue that's interfering with the process and their life in general, and help them begin to have some balance in looking at their experience. So I'm always working towards, because mindfulness is focused on helping us be with what is, I'm always working towards that goal. And sometimes in order to work towards that goal, when clients come in, I need to start with providing them with some particular resource to help them get to a more balanced place, to be able to work with what is.
Okay. And I have a question from someone who works in an inpatient psychiatric unit. Can you speak to the particular risks or benefits of mindfulness practice in work with clients with schizophrenia, bipolar, and psychosis?
Yeah. So risks and is mindfulness practice safe is a hot topic now. There's good research on mindfulness practice at a beginning level in terms of its efficacy around self-regulation, particularly around depression, anxiety, pain, those kinds of things. And I think there's a new interest in research on, can we locate any iatrogenic effects? What are the limits of this practice? So I would say when you're working with more vulnerable clients, you want to be more careful in terms of starting with briefer periods of practice, checking in, understanding how they're receiving it, adapting it to their needs. There is someone, his name is Paul Chadwick, who's done a lot of work around adapting mindfulness practice for work with folks with schizophrenia, and he's worth looking up. So that work is being done. These techniques are being used effectively with people with a wide variety of psychotic disorders and symptoms. But you would need to go carefully, be doing a lot of structuring and checking in, and be starting to use short practices.
Okay, and are there any visualization CDs or YouTube clips that you could recommend?
there's so much out there now. It's hard to recommend any particular thing. I would go to the more sort of tested sources like Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts or UCLA Center for Mindfulness, the UK Mindfulness Center, that are well-established teacher training places and have pretty extensive research programs. They're pretty careful about their practice. They often have some materials available for free, and some of them will incorporate some visualization, although they're probably heavy on basic practices. But some of them will have some version of the mountain meditation or loving kindness, certainly.
All right, and the next question is, can these techniques work in group settings?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, half of the research on mindfulness really is done with MBSR, which is absolutely in a group setting. So definitely these practices can work in group settings, and I've used them in lots of different ways. One of the ways that actually got into bringing my personal practice into my work a long, long time ago was that I worked in a women's addictions program with 95% of our folks were trauma survivors, and between getting sober and having trauma symptoms come up, really just had so much difficulty with urges and working with feelings, and so started to introduce the meditation both at the beginning and at the end of group, which did a lot and was really useful in terms of helping people begin to approach and contain working with feelings in a group setting. So I think that that's, and I know actually that that's really potentially very, very useful. And there are many manuals out there also. There are manuals around using these practice in addictions as well as other kinds of groups, and of course MBSR itself there's a lot of information on.
Great, thank you. I have another question. How would you approach insomnia in first responders where their circadian rhythms are disrupted by extended work hours?
Right, that's a more difficult issue. So, you always want to first understand kind of how dysregulated the person in front of you is, right? Sort of where they are, just like you would with anybody coming in from any other perspective. So I would have a lot of questions about where they are, what their coping is. Probably, one of the things that happens when you have people who are sleep deprived or sleep disordered is that one of the first things that they start to do is they start to sleep, right, as soon as they relax at all. So I think it's actually potentially productive in terms of helping them work with both the neurobiology of self-regulation and in terms of working with them in being more present at specific moments. So I always tend to start with more, once I've done an assessment and understand how this might fit for someone, why am I using it and what am I using it on, what are their goals, then I choose the practices, often starting with as basic practices as I can, that go with that, and start in short periods in session, see how they respond, and then give them homework around those short periods. So I try to find something that they can really use immediately. I think in some ways the body scan, which is traditional to MBSR, is a great thing to use at a beginning level with somebody with sleep issues, because it keeps you aware of physical sensations, which is very grounding. Sorry.
Our last question for today is, can you speak a little bit about mindful eating?
Right, mindfulness. So there's Jean Christeller's work is really well known around mindful eating and worth looking up. So it can be really, really useful because often when people are having problems with eating, they really aren't in contact with either sensations of hunger or satiation. So mindful eating is often a concrete activity that people enjoy beginning with. Of course, they won't enjoy it if eating's an issue for them, but it's a great activity to begin to work with in small chunks. And I've just had people repeatedly begin to make a chain of connections, first around noticing, A, that they're absent when they're eating, and then beginning to make choices. So you always want to help folks titrate things. So there's no, as somebody said to me the other night in the group that I was running, one of the things I love about what you guys are saying is there's no goal. Like, I don't get caught up because I'm not focused on, oh, I need to get here with it. So I can actually be with what's happening. And so I can realize that what's happening is, wow, I'm tuning out every time I sit down to eat. And actually, I kind of want to. So there I'm in that moment of, so the next step is taking apart that habit, is being in that next moment of seeing themselves make that choice. And then the next moment might be that they might do something different with that choice, even for just a few moments, and what would that be like? So it can have a very powerful impact on eating. And in the groups that I normally do, it does often have a actually powerful impact on eating.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dacko, for presenting this very useful information to us. And thank you to our audience for interacting and asking some really great questions. We hope you can take what you've learned and apply it to your work. Please be sure to view the recording of the webinar as well as any other resources mentioned on our website, www.ctac.com. In addition, if you have any further questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us via email. And once again, just to go over the CEU process, you will want to log on to the NYU Silver School CE online portal with your username and password, or create an account. That's at sswforms.es.its.nyu.edu. Click on All Events and Programs at the top of the page. Select webinar under Online Learning. Complete the requested information and pay the processing fee. Within 24 to 48 hours, you should gain access to the post-test. Complete the post-test and follow the instructions to receive your certificate. And all attendees to this webinar will receive an email with all this information in about 1 day. So thank you again for attending, and take care.
Thank you.